Looking for magic cards? At flipsidegaming.com you can now use the promo code LVD to get a 10% discount on orders over $10 while supporting the channel at the same time. Hello and welcome to another Magic Arena gameplay video. Today we're taking a look at the Auras of Majesty starter deck. First off, we'll take a look at the deck list and play a game with the deck without making any changes to it out of the box, and then afterwards we'll gradually upgrade the deck and then play a few games with the upgraded deck as well. So let's dive into it here. Auras of Majesty is a green-white aura-based deck, which means we'll be playing a bunch of creatures and then enchanting those creatures with auras, so like Oakenform for example, enhancing our creature, giving it +3/+3 in this case. So let's take a look at our entire list. At 1 mana we've got 3 copies of Novice Knight, 1 mana for a 2/3 defender, but as long as Novice Knight is enchanted or equipped, it can attack as though it didn't have defender. We've got 2 copies of Daybreak Chaplain, 2 mana for a 1/3 with a lifelink, so pretty good target for those enchantments. We've got 3 copies of Night's Pledge, 2 mana for an aura, giving our creature +2/+2. We have 2 copies of Greenwood Sentinel, 2 mana for a 2/2 creature with Vigilance. 1 copy of Thor Lieutenant, 2 mana for a 2/3, and whenever Thor Lieutenant becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, we get to make a 1/1 Elf Warrior creature token, and for 6 mana we can give Lieutenant +4/+4 until end of turn. We also have 1 copy of Siegehorn Ceratops, 2 mana for a 2/2 creature with Enrage, and whenever Siegehorn Ceratops is dealt damage, we can put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. We've got 1 copy of Danitha, 3 mana for a 2/2 legendary creature with First Strike, Vigilance and Lifelink, and aura and equipment spells we cast cost 1 generic mana less to cast. Then we also have 1 copy of Hystra Benalia as a powerful enchantment, making a 2/2 Knight token on the first 2 turns, and on the 3rd turn giving our Knight creatures +2/+1 until end of turn. We've got 3 copies of Luminous Bonds as a removal spell, enchanting an opposing creature so it can't attack or block. Then we have 3 copies of Oakenform, giving our enchanted creature +3/+3. Another payoff card for playing all of those enchantments is Satyr Enchanter, 3 mana for a 2/2 creature that says whenever we cast an enchantment spell, draw a card. We've got 1 Ajani's Last Stand, which is a 4 mana enchantment that says whenever a creature or planeswalker we control dies, we can sacrifice the Last Stand, and if we do we get to make a 4/4 white avatar creature token with flying, and when a spell or ability an opponent control causes us to discard the Last Stand, if we control a planes, we get to make a 4/4 white avatar creature token with flying. We've got another removal spell in the form of Hieromancer's Cage, which is a 4 mana enchantment that can exile target a non-land permanent an opponent controls until the cage leaves the battlefield. We've got 1 On Sarah's Wings as a powerful legendary enchantment aura that can enchant one of our creatures, giving it +1/+1, flying, vigilance and lifelink, and also turns it into a legendary creature. We also have 1 copy of Shalai, Voice of Plenty, 4 mana for a 3/4 legendary creature with flying, giving us planeswalkers we control and other creatures we control hexproof, and for 6 mana we can put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control. Then we've got 3 copies of Druid of Horns, which is another payoff card for playing all those auras, 4 mana for a 2/3 creature that says whenever you cast an aura spell that targets Druid of Horns, create a 3/3 green beast creature token. Then we've got 2 copies of Knightly Valor as another powerful aura, 5 mana to give the enchanted creature +2/+2 and Vigilance, and then when the Knightly Valor enters the battlefield we also get to make a 2/2 Knight creature token with Vigilance. And last but not least, 1 Prodigious Growth, 6 mana for an aura, giving the enchanted creature +7/+7 and Trample. And then our mana base is pretty straightforward, 11 plains, 9 forests, 1 Sunpetal Grove enters untapped if we control a forest or a plains, and then 4 Tranquil Expanse, which always enters the battlefield tapped. So that's our deck. Now let's jump into a game and see how the deck does. Alright, we're on the play, and this hand looks okay. We've got several creatures to enchant. Only 1 Oakenform so far, so this hand is hoping to draw a few more auras, so we can take full use of the Druid of Horns. The Novice Knight for now is not going to do a whole lot, but if our opponent has some creatures they want to attack with, Novice Knight's going to make for a good blocker. Opponent maybe on a mono green deck. Turn to Druid of the Cowl. And against a mono green deck, one of the good things about this deck is that we're not really going to get punished as much for committing a whole bunch of auras onto 1 creature, since once we get our creature bigger than the opponent's creatures, they can't kill it with fight spells, like a Rabbit Bite for example. Alright, Ajani's Last Stand, don't have double white at the moment. So, Could just put an Oaken Form on our Satyr Enchanter, but I think we played slow. Played Druid of Horns first, and then next turn put the Oaken Form on the Druid of Horns, drawing us a card and making a Beast token. And hope that they don't kill the Druid of Horns here, or the Satyr Enchanter, with a Rabbit Bite. It's going to be a Vigilant Baloth. So if we put an Oaken Form on the Druid of Horns, it's still going to be large enough to survive a Rabbit Bite using the Baloth. Centaur coming in, we'll take for now. Don't really want to lose any of our 2 creatures here. Alright, so now we can go ahead and play our Oaken Form, targeting Druid. And pick up a Chaplain, which we can still play. And then, do we attack? I think we do, since we have plenty of creatures on defense now to block the Vigilant Baloth. And then we're just hoping to draw more Auras to put on our Druid of Horns to make it even bigger. And it's going to be an aggressive Mammoth. Alright, that's a big one. So now the thing we're afraid of is a Rabbit Bite next turn using the aggressive Mammoth, killing the Druid of Horns. We're pretty happy to double block the Vigilant Baloth here. Could also double block Centaur Courser with Satyr Enchanter and Chaplain, but since we have a last stand coming up, we'll get to draw more cards with the Enchanter, which is worth it. Could actually also throw in a block over here just to gain 1 life, since our opponent's likely to kill our 3/3 beast anyway, so we gain 1 life for free by blocking with the Chaplain. Alright, our opponent actually decided to kill our Daybreak Chaplain instead of the beast token, which is fine. Let's play a last stand, draw a card, see what we can find. Alright, so if our opponent does have the Rabbit Bite, we could be in a bit of trouble here, as we'll lose our largest creature. And we're still facing down an aggressive Mammoth. And instead it's going to be a Prey Upon. Almost the same thing, the only exception here is that now the aggressive Mammoth can't really attack, since it has been dealt 5 damage. So now we could just block it with our Beast token. On the bright side, we did get a 4/4 Avatar token with flying. That can maybe do some damage. Interesting, the Mammoth is attacking, probably indicates that they have a pump spell like a Titanic Growth that they want to use. We could play around it by double blocking the aggressive Mammoth, but then of course we would be throwing away 2 creatures. Opponent decides to not attack, so probably indicates that they don't have the pump spell here, and they're just going to play another Vigilant Baloth second main. Alright, well, if we don't draw an enchantment soon, then this game's going to be over. For now we're just going to play more creatures, can't really afford to attack with our flying creature here, need our creature back on defense, on blocking duty. So all the opponent's creatures have trample. So last turn we put them on not having a pump spell, so we could safely block the Centaur Courser with our 4/4. And then we could try and double block the Vigilant Baloth with our Beast and the Novice Knight, which would be a fine trade. Beast for Baloth. And then we would be taking 8 trample damage. I think that's acceptable. So we'll block like this. And hold on to our Satyr Enchanter and Druid of Horns for now, hoping to top deck an Aura. Alright, opponent does have the Titanic Growth. Alright, on Sarah's Wings was the perfect top deck here. And another Novice Knight. So now we can attack for 3, gain 3. Opponent with just a land, and everyone's still getting in there. Alright, so how are we going to block here? This is a pretty easy block, and then we could just triple block the aggressive Mammoth, and our opponent gets to choose 2 creatures to kill here, and we get to keep one of them. I think that's fair. And then we'll be left with a Novice Knight, and then maybe a Satyr Enchanter, maybe an Avatar token. Alright, opponent leaves us with the Satyr Enchanter. So don't really want to waste the Luminous Bonds on the Druid of the Cowl, we just want to keep it. Of course, had we drawn this sooner, we would have just been able to answer the aggressive Mammoth without having to throw away 2 of our creatures. So let's play our land in case we draw more stuff with a Satyr Enchanter and need access to more mana. And then just say go for now. And if our opponent draws another large green creature, we can Luminous Bonds it, draw a card with the Satyr Enchanter. But we're not really in a hurry. We'll keep playing our lands for now, I think. Alright, Greenwood Sentinel's not really an issue. Can just block it with our Novice Knights. We'll play the Chaplain. Opponent could also be holding some removal spells on hand at this point. Alright, more Luminous Bonds. I think we're still patient here. And then hope our Satyr Enchanter doesn't get killed. Llanowar Elves is fine. They could easily be holding some pump spells as well. If our opponent had a Galta in hand, they would have been able to cast it last turn, so don't think that's what they're holding. Alright, let's keep playing lands. Of course, if we still had one of our flying creatures, we might have been able to kill our opponent by now. So the Luminous Bonds came a turn too late. Let's see who's the first one to break the board stall. Alright, a Knight's Pledge. So we could just put the Knight's Pledge on the Novice Knight instead. So it survives the triple block. But if our opponent has a pump spell, we still trade. But we get to draw a card with a Satyr Enchanter, so that's probably worth it. We don't necessarily have to attack with a Novice Knight here, but I think it's okay. So we'll see a block and a Titanic Growth. Nope, just a chum block. Interesting. So maybe our opponent's hand is quite weak, they're just holding a bunch of lands, who knows. Highland Game, that's fine. So now the triple block could kill the Novice Knight. It is tempting to just Luminous Bonds one of the opponent's creatures now. Given that they chum blocked last turn, that's kind of a sign that their hand is quite weak. So I don't hate just aggressively using one of our Luminous Bonds so our Novice Knight can keep attacking. And then the question is what do we enchant? The Highland Game to prevent a life game or the Sentinel, which has Vigilance, but the Vigilance is not too relevant here. So I think we Luminous Bonds the Highland Game. And then attack. Alright, another chum block. So maybe next turn we can go for an even more aggressive line. And the reason we're still playing out our lands is imagine drawing another Satyr Enchanter, then playing the Luminous Bonds and suddenly needing every single mana we can get. Alright, Sentinel gets in. We'll just block with our Chaplain. If they want to use a pump spell, that's totally fine. Otherwise we gain one. Alright, it's going to be a Verdant Rebirth, just to draw a card. So not too effective. And our opponent says go, and there's another Satyr Enchanter, so now I think we go for it. Enchant this, draw 2. And a Druid of Horns. So let's go ahead and attack with everyone. Opponent's down to 1, play a Druid. And I guess we'll still play out our land here. And next turn attack with everyone. Alright, there's a Rabbit Bite, killing a Satyr Enchanter, that's fine. And another one. So they could have used one of those earlier. They maybe should have, just to prevent us from drawing cards with a Satyr Enchanter. A third Rabbit Bite, so yeah, they definitely had a bunch of Rabbit Bites they could have used. Alright, sweet. Alright, now that we got to see the deck in action, it's time to gradually upgrade our deck, and we will try to stay true to the main theme of the deck, which is playing a bunch of creatures and enchanting them with auras to make them better. And one of the main weaknesses of that strategy typically is exposing yourself to opposing removal spells, killing your creature and your aura, and setting you back on card advantage that way. So one of the things we'll try to introduce to our deck is more resilient creatures that either gain indestructible somehow, or have hexproof so the opponent can't target them with spot removal spells, so we kind of insulate ourselves from those opposing removal spells, so we don't get 2-for-1 as badly. So that's one of the main things we will slowly introduce into our deck. But first off, there's a bunch of cards we can add to the deck without having to use any wild cards, since we get them from the other starter decks. And one of those cards is the 6-mana Carnage Tyrant, 6 mana for a 7/6 creature with trample and hexproof, so fits perfectly into this deck as a recipient for auras that doesn't expose us to opposing removal spells, and also has the upside of not being able to be countered by opposing counterspells, so also a nice spell against opposing counterspell decks. So we can add 1 copy of Carnage Tyrant, which you can find in the red-green starter deck, Primal Fury. And then another card we can add to our deck is a 2nd copy of Prodigious Growth, which we get in the mono-green starter deck for a Smite, so everyone should have access to a 2nd copy from the start. And that's going to be another nice powerful curve topper to put on future hexproof creatures perhaps, as a nice +7/+7 and trample. And then finally another card we can add to our deck from one of the other starter decks is a few copies of Seal Away, which you can find in the blue-white starter deck, which is either called Wing and Claw or Artifacts Attack based upon when you joined the beta. And Seal Away makes for a nice cheap removal spell, also happens to be an enchantment, so still triggers our Satyr Enchanters to draw extra cards, so the perfect fit for this deck. So we'll add 2 copies to the main deck, and we could put more copies in the sideboard if we're facing those aggressive creature decks where Seal Away shines. Alright, now that we've introduced some extra cards to the deck, we'll have to make some cuts to go back down to 60 cards. We can easily cut some Novice Knights, since they're not the most high impact card, and as we saw in the previous game, it does take a while before we end up enchanting them, since there are so many better targets for our enchantments than a 1-mana 2/3. So we'll cut a Novice Knight. And then we can also get away with cutting a land, even though we just added 2 extra 6-drops to the deck to make the curve a bit higher. We did notice in the previous game as well that we ended up flooding out, and we do still have the card draw from Satyr Enchanter, which lets us see more cards, so we're more likely to hit our land drops as well. So we can go down to 24 lands, and then since we added 2 removal spells in the form of Seal Away, we can afford to get rid of some copies of Luminous Bonds or Hieromancer's Cage. We'll just go with 1 of each for now, and we'll be back down to 60 cards. And now it's time to add some wild cards to the deck. So we'll go over all the commons first in order of importance, and then we'll do the same with the uncommons, the rares and the mythics, but there won't be any mythics that we need to add to the deck. So it's just going to be commons, uncommons and rares. And one of the first commons we want to add to our deck is some copies of Squire's Devotion, 3 mana for an enchantment aura that goes onto one of our creatures, giving it +1/+1 and giving it lifelink. And when Squire's Devotion enters the battlefield, we also get to make a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink. So this is an excellent enchantment in those racing scenarios, and also a nightmare for the mono-red deck to deal with. So we'll add all 4 copies of Squire's Devotion to our deck. And then the final common we'll add to the deck is a 4th copy of Oakenform as a pretty high impact aura, giving our creature +3/+3, and curves nicely with a 2 mana creature into a 3 mana aura, like Squire's Devotion and Oakenform, so those fit in our curve nicely. So those will be all the commons we want to add to the deck, and I will have to make some cuts for those newly added cards. I don't mind cutting the Night Pledges since they're pretty low impact auras as far as auras go. 2 mana for +2/+2 is not as good I think as Oakenform or Squire's Devotion, so we'll end up cutting all 3 copies of Night's Pledge. And then we can also end up cutting the 2 extra copies of Novice Knight, which is mainly just a good blocker against opposing aggro decks, but now that we've added more lifelink elements with Squire's Devotion, we can just outrace most opposing aggro decks, so we don't need to rely on having an early blocker like Novice Knight. So we're back down to 60 cards. So now it's time to introduce the uncommons to the deck, and one of the most important uncommons we can add is Adanto Vanguard, 2 mana for a 1/1 creature that gets +2/+0 as long as it's attacking, so attacks as a 3/1, and we can pay for life to make Adanto Vanguard indestructible until end of turn, so that makes it a great recipient for auras, since we can always make it indestructible in response to most opposing removal spells. Do still have to watch out for removal spells that exile our creature, since their indestructible is not going to help, and also have to watch out for removal spells that maybe give -X/-X, like for example a Moment of Craving on a 1 toughness Adanto Vanguard still kills it even if we make it indestructible, so we have to watch out for those effects as well. But once we put a bunch of enchantments on our Vanguard, it can maybe survive those -X/-X effects as well. So we will add all 4 copies of Adanto Vanguard to our deck. And Adanto Vanguard also plays very well with our Squire's Devotion. Giving it lifelink means that we can more easily afford to pay the 4 life to make it indestructible, so it can keep attacking into opposing creatures as well. And to make room for Adanto Vanguard, we can cut some of the weaker 2-drops like Daybreak Chaplain, which we don't need the lifelink as much now that we've added Squire's Devotion, and we can also cut the Greenwood Sentinel, which is quite weak. So we're back down to 60. And then the next uncommon we want to add to our deck is another resilient creature that we can easily enchant, which is Vinemare, 4 mana for a 5/3 creature with hexproof that cannot be blocked by black creatures, which is also pretty relevant. So we'll add all 4 copies of Vinemare to our deck, another great recipient for auras thanks to hexproof. Of course, it does cost 4 mana, so unlike Adanto Vanguard, where we can curve Adanto Vanguard into a 3 mana enchantment, we have to wait until 4 mana for the Vinemare, but in some matchups it's worth the wait since we will have a creature that's more resilient to opposing removal spells. And to make room for Vinemare, we can easily cut Ajani's Last Stand, which is kind of a conditional creature which our opponent can sort of play around and doesn't always work out. So we'll cut Ajani's Last Stand. And now that we're introducing more resilient creatures like Adanto Vanguard and Vinemare, we don't really need to rely on the effect that Druid of Horns provides as much, since going all in with a bunch of enchantments on a Druid of Horns that then ends up dying to an opposing removal spells, even though we get a few beast tokens, is just not as good as just being able to put all those auras on a safe Vinemare or Adanto Vanguard target. So we'll end up cutting the Druid of Horns as well. And also as an individual threat, Vinemare is a lot better than Druid of Horns as it hits for 5 instead of 2. Then for our next uncommon, we can easily add the 4th copy of Satyr Enchanter as a nice payoff card for playing a bunch of enchantments. And then we also want to max out the copies of On Sarah's Wings, which is another very powerful enchantment that can swing the race in our favor against any opposing creature deck. And of course, introducing more lifelink also works very nicely with cards like Adanto Vanguard in our deck. And just imagine putting an On Sarah's Wings on a Vinemare. That's going to be very difficult for most decks to deal with. So we'll add all 4 copies of On Sarah's Wings to our deck. Do of course have to watch out for the legendary rule, but usually 1 Vinemare with On Sarah's Wings is good enough, so I doubt you'll run into that situation too often. And to make room for our newly added cards, we can easily cut the 2 copies of Knightly Valor, which is a similar effect to On Sarah's Wings, also giving Vigilance, but On Sarah's Wings being cheaper and higher impact just makes it a better card in my opinion, so we can cut the 2 Knightly Valors. And then, since we did introduce so much life gain to our deck with the Squire's Devotion and the On Sarah's Wings, we don't really need to answer opposing creatures as much, so we don't really need a card like Luminous Bonds as much, just because we can easily outrace opposing creature decks with all the life gain we have, so we can afford to cut the Luminous Bonds. So we're back down to 60. And then another uncommon we can add to the deck is Conclave Tribunal, which is just going to be a minor upgrade over the 2 copies of Hieromancer's Cage that we currently have in our deck. Being able to tap creatures for Convoke does come up since we have creatures like Satyr Enchanter and maybe some tokens from Squire's Devotion or from Thorn Lieutenant that won't really be attacking all that much, so being able to tap them for Convoke can let us cast it on the cheap, which can be quite useful in certain scenarios. So we'll add 2 copies of Conclave Tribunal to our deck and cut the 2 copies of Hieromancer's Cage as a small upgrade. And in terms of the final build of the deck, Conclave Tribunal would be the last uncommon we add to it since we don't need any additional ones. But just in case you have more uncommon wildcards available than rare wildcards available, you could also consider adding some copies of Knight of Grace to the deck as a 2-mana 2/2 creature with First Strike and Hexproof from black, which means that it can be the target of black spells or abilities our opponents control, which makes it very resilient against black removal spells like Vraska's Contempt, Cast Down, Moment of Craving, Assassin's Trophy, you name it, can also survive opposing Vraska activations from the 4-mana and the 6-mana Vraska, so definitely has its place in some matchups. and lets us survive opposing removal spells, so the Knight of Grace becomes a safe target to put our auras onto. So we could add some copies of Knight of Grace, which would easily substitute the Ceratops, which is pretty weak, and Danitha, given that Danitha is not the safest target to put our enchantments onto, even though the discount on auras can be nice. And then we could also consider cutting our Hystra Benalia from the deck. Even though individually it's a very strong card, it doesn't actually synergize with our main game plan of playing a bunch of resilient creatures and enchanting them with auras. And apart from the Knight of Grace that we just added, we don't have any other knights that benefit from the third chapter. So we could cut the Hystra Benalia, since we're also a bit saturated at 3 mana with the Oakenform, Squire's Devotion and Satyr Enchanter, and make room for a third Knight of Grace as another nice 2-drop that we can curve into one of our 3 mana enchantments like Oakenform and Squire's Devotion. And of course in the right matchups where our opponent relies on those black removal spells, Knight of Grace is going to shine. Otherwise, if you do have the rare wildcards, we won't be needing Knight of Grace for the main deck, and we can just move it into the sideboard for those matchups where we expect to face a lot of black spot removal spells. And then instead of having Knight of Grace, we would rely more on copies of Thorn Lieutenant, which is still not the most resilient target for our enchantments, but at least if our opponent targets it with a removal spell, we get a 1/1 Elf Warrior creature token. And also in the late game, imagine having a Thorn Lieutenant enchanted by a Squire's Devotion, giving it lifelink. Then if we get 6 mana, we can give it +4/+4, so that makes for a pretty big life gain swing in our favor. And if our opponent relies on damage-based removal spells, that extra point of toughness over the Knight of Grace can also be very helpful, as it survives shock, and if we enchant it with a Squire's Devotion, it survives a 3 damage burn spell like Lightning Strike as well. So overall, I think I prefer the Thorn Lieutenant for the main deck, but if you're playing sideboarded games, then Knight of Grace can be an excellent addition to the sideboard. But if you do have the wildcards, I suggest upping the number of Thorn Lieutenants up to 4, and then our 2-drops become 4 copies of Adanto Vanguard and 4 copies of Thorn Lieutenant as nice creatures to enchant. And now all that's left to do is to improve the mana base a little bit, and in green-white we do get access to a bunch of dual lands, so we can add all 4 copies of Temple Garden to our deck, which is both a forest and a plains for Sunpetal Grove purposes, and enters battlefield untapped if we pay 2 life. And then we can also max out on Sunpetal Grove, which of course synergizes nicely with our Temple Garden, so ensure we have a nice smooth mana base, and we can afford to cut the Tranquil Expanse, which always enters the battlefield tapped. And then we will go down to 6 plains, since we need to prioritize double green for cards like Vinemare, and then we'll go up to 10 forests, so we're still at 60 cards, 24 lands, and we have 18 green sources, which helps for the double green on cards like Vinemare, and still 14 white sources, which is plenty for our turn 2 Adanto Vanguards. Then we can also change the art on our basic lands if we want to. I like this plains, I think we can do better on the forests. So just type forest in the search bar, and then under filters, click reset, and you'll get to see all the basic land arts. And I think we'll go for this one. And then we can click on the plus button to add all 10 copies, and cut the other one. Alright, so that rounds out our main deck. Then we can take a quick look at the sideboard. If you're interested in playing best of 3 games with this deck, I can give some suggestions for the sideboard. And we already mentioned Knight of Grace as an excellent sideboard card against decks that rely on black removal spells. So we can add maybe all 4 copies of Knight of Grace to the sideboard if we want to. Then another useful sideboard card could be the Honor Guard, 2 mana for a 1/3 creature that says creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger, and of course none of the creatures in our deck have enters the battlefield abilities, so it's just to slow down the opponent. And against decks like the black-green midrange deck that has a bunch of creatures with enter battlefield abilities, this can be a very effective sideboard card, so we could go up to even 4 copies of the Honor Guard if we wanted to. Then we can also consider more removal spells, like Seal Away we mentioned earlier. Can be a nice one against, for example, the Phoenix deck that has a bunch of recursive creatures like Arclight Phoenix, and of course Crackling Drake and Enigma Drake can also be nice targets for Seal Away that otherwise could kill us out of nowhere. So could add 2 more copies of Seal Away to the sideboard. We could also consider adding a second copy of Shalai. We have one in the main deck as an excellent card that can help us protect our non-hexproof creatures from opposing removal spells, as well as having a nice late game ability for 6 mana. But we could add a second copy of Shalai to our sideboard against decks that rely on cards like Cellular Wreckage to interact with our hexproof creatures, since of course Shalai prevents the opponent from targeting players as well, and Cellular Wreckage does indeed target players, so that's a helpful tool against those decks. So we could add one extra Shalai to the sideboard, of course also pretty good against the burn decks, as the burn opponent won't be able to target us with their burn spells. Then we could also consider some copies of Ajani, Adversary of Tyrants, as a nice planeswalker against the more controlling decks, as a way to return our 2-mana creatures from the graveyard to the battlefield, and then putting +1/+1 counters on up to 2 creatures. And then of course the ultimate can also be game winning, so we can add 2 copies of Ajani to the sideboard, for example. We could also consider another planeswalker like Vivian Reed. Not necessarily the most synergistic in our deck, since it can't help us find enchantments with the +1 ability, but still a very powerful way to deal with opposing enchantments or flyers, and the +1 still provides card advantage, helping us find creatures and lands. So we could add a Vivian Reed to the sideboard, and then we could also consider adding a second copy of Carnage Tyrant to the sideboard against those counterspell heavy decks. But there's plenty more options to explore. For example, we could play our own copy of Settle the Wreckage against opposing creature decks, but the problem here is that we don't have many other instants in our deck, so if we pass a turn with 4 mana up, other than maybe Seal Away or a Shalai activation, we're going to be representing a Settle the Wreckage pretty clearly, so if our opponent knows about it, they can pretty easily play around it. But otherwise it could still be an effective tool in those creature matchups. But usually creature matchups are winnable if we can just land one of our lifelink enchantments like Squire's Devotion or on Sarah's Wings on one of our resilient creatures like Vinemare or Adanto Vanguard if they don't have a way to exile it. So that's the deck. Now let's jump into some games and see how the deck does. Alright, we're on the play. And this hand looks okay. Got 2 nice threats in Vanguard and Vinemare and an aura in the form of Oakenform. So this is a type of hand where we want to draw additional auras since we have the 2 creatures already. And one of them is bound to be good in this matchup. Opponent on blue-red. So if this is a Drake-style deck, Adanto Vanguard's a great threat that they'll struggle to deal with. Prodigious Growth could also be a nice curve topper here to maybe help us close out the game. Alright, Satyr Enchanter's not bad, but it's probably gonna die. So I don't mind just going for the Oakenform here. If that works. Get in for 6. Opponent with an end of turn Radical Idea to draw a card. Next turn we're probably just gonna run out the Vinemare, unless we pick up a sweet enchantment to put on the Vanguard. Alright, our opponent is on Jeskai, which makes things a little trickier, since now they could have access to a number of exile effects as well. But we're just gonna attack for 6, see what happens, and then play Vinemare, hope it doesn't get syncopated or Essence Scattered. Could also maybe try to play the Satyr Enchanter instead, to play around, set, counterspell. Definitely an interesting spot here. Opponent could be holding a Deafening Clarion, which doesn't do anything against the Vanguard but still kills the Vinemare. Yeah, I could see playing the Enchanter here. And then they might be tempted to spend some resources killing the Satyr Enchanter, and then maybe next turn we'll be able to resolve the Vinemare, who knows. But our opponent just can't deal with the Adanto Vanguard here and scoops it up. Yeah, sometimes we'll have these quick games where we just land an early threat backed up by an enchantment and our opponent just doesn't have any way to interact and has to scoop it up. Alright, on to the next one. Alright, we're on the play, and we're missing white mana sadly. This hand's definitely not great. Do need quite a few lands for Vinemare and Carnage Tyrants. No white mana for Vanguard, so this hand's not doing much for a while until we find our lands. I don't mind mulliganing. Alright, this is okay. Of course, our only threat being Thorn Lieutenant might not always work out. And I think we need to keep the land on top here, just to be able to cast our 3 and 4 mana spells in time. And then hopefully Lieutenant survives and matches up well against what the opponent is doing. And we don't mind seeing turn 1 Mountain. So the hope is that they don't kill the Lieutenant on the spot. But even if they do, we still get a token out of the deal, so it could be worse. And we would love for them to tap out for a creature here, instead of keeping up an instant. Alright, they are going to go for the Wizard's Lining anyway here. So that's too bad. So now we can't Squire's Devotion on the Thorn Lieutenant. And they're gonna shock the token too. Alright, so completely takes us off of any creature. And yeah, now we've got the problem of these aura-based decks. If you don't have any creatures, then you can't enchant them. We could have opted to Squire's Devotion on the opponent's Lava Runner just to get a 1/1 lifelinking token, but then we're also giving the Lava Runner +1/+1 and lifelink, which would not be great. So I think we wait for now. Alright, Adanto Vanguard's actually pretty good here with all these lifelink enchantments, so I think we'll be okay now. They could of course make us pay a bunch of life by targeting the Adanto Vanguard with their burn spells, and we're gonna be forced to pay, but eventually we'll make up for it by gaining a bunch of life. So I think we're gonna be fine now. Alright, step 1, I think we on Sarah's Wings here. Yeah, I think so. And then next turn we can go for the Oaken Form. So we'll attack for 4. They're gonna make us pay for life here. But then we'll gain it right back. Could also block the Lava Runner and then pay for life, but we'll see. Alright, they're gonna Lava Coil, that's another 4 life, but now we can block the Lava Runner for free, so they should have considered maybe attacking first in case we don't block. Pyromancer puts us to 8, but now we get to untap and play an Oaken Form on the Vanguard, and that's gonna be too much for them to handle. Alright. Goblin Chain Whirler, that's fine. And no attacks. And now we can untap and play another Oaken Form. And that should be lethal. Alright, sweet. Managed to beat Mono Red. On to the next one. Alright, we're on the play, sadly with a 1-lander, which is going to be difficult to keep. So we'll go to 6. Alright, it's not a perfect hand, but could get there with some help. So we'll keep this one and then hope to find enough land so we can play Shalai or find a cheap creature in the meantime. Carnage Tyrant's a bit ambitious here. Put that on the bottom. So we'll play Sunpetal Grove. Let's see what we're up against. Turn 1 Plains into a Leonin Vanguard, so an aggressive white creature-based deck. So this is where the Squire's Devotion potentially is gonna help us race. Turn 2 Sky Marcher Aspirants. Into another 1-drop Healer's Hawk. Alright, so I think we're okay using the Seal Away on the Leonin Vanguard here, just to relieve a little bit of pressure. Make it more difficult for the opponent to convoke a Loxodon. Alright, let's play Thorn Lieutenant. And then hope to draw a 3rd land soon, and then we can go Satyr Enchanter into one of our 3-mana enchantments. Of course, the opponent does have Conclave Tribunal as interaction, which can easily exile Thorn Lieutenant with a bunch of enchantments on it. So that's where Shalai will hopefully come in. Alright, an interesting attack with the Aspirant. Does not have flying yet. Opponent could have a pump spell here. But I think we're okay if we trade for a pump spell. And yep, it's going to be Pride of Conquerors, but we still managed to kill the Aspirants. So that worked out, I think. Play our Satyr Enchanter. And then hopefully we draw land first for Shalai before we have to put a bunch of enchantments on our Satyr Enchanter. But if we don't find it, then we might still go for it. Opponent with an Adanto Vanguard, which is also a good target for cards like Seal Away. Alright, so did not find a 4th land, so I think we just commit here. And then we have to decide between Squire's Devotion and Oaken Form. The upside of Squire's Devotion, of course, besides gaining us life, is that it makes a 1/1 token that we can maybe enchant in the future if they deal with the Satyr Enchanter. So I don't mind going for the Devotion first here. And there's a land, perfect. So next turn we get to play Shalai, which is going to help protect our Satyr Enchanter from opposing removal spells. So they'll need 2 of them before they can reach our Enchanter. Alright, it's going to be another Leonin Vanguard, which gains them 1 life, and they can attack us with the Hawk, and they're also attacking with the Vanguard. We could block with the token here, but if their last card is Conclave Tribunal exiling the Enchanter, that would be bad, so I think we just take it for now. Alright, so let's play our Shalai, and that's going to make us feel a lot safer. And then this is definitely attacking, and we might as well attack with the Vampire token since we're okay trading for the Vanguard. And then next turn we can go crazy putting enchantments on our Satyr Enchanter or on the Vampire token if that works out better. Has a Marshal, that's fine. Can make more tokens, but they'll have a hard time attacking here. If the Adanto Vanguard attacks, we'll have to be careful to not run into another Pride of Conquerors, since that could kill Shalai. So we might not block the Vanguard, but we'll definitely block the rest. And no attacks from our opponents, pick up our own Conclave Tribunal. Alright, so what's the play here? Could put an Oaken Form on Satyr Enchanter, and then our opponent can just block with the Adanto Vanguard and pay for life to make it indestructible instead of taking 6. If we put the Oaken Form on the Vampire token, opponent could do the same. And we're happy if they chum block, we're happy if they quadruple block. So I think that works out a bit better, spreading out the enchantments a bit. And I don't want to put anything on Shalai in case they do find Tribunal, otherwise they get rid of Shalai and all the enchantments. I guess we're also fine if the Enchanter trades for a bunch of creatures at this point. So I don't mind attacking with the Enchanter and the Vampire token. But we'll keep Shalai back, so we have at least 1 blocker. Opponent takes it all, play a tap Temple Garden, and then next turn, if we draw land, we could play 2 copies of Oaken Form. Vanguard gains them 1 life, and they will be attacking with everyone. So now let's see, they've got 5 creatures, 4 lands, so Pride of Conquerors still does not have the City's Blessing. So I think we're safe to block the Vanguard. Question is that the most problematic creature here? Do we just block the Haza Marshal? Or the Healer's Hawk? I could actually see blocking the Haza Marshal since the opponent making a bunch of tokens could be annoying in the long run. So we take a bit of damage. Ooh, Prodigious Growth. We're 1 land away from it. But for now we can just play another Oaken Form, put it on the token, I guess. Draw a card. Vinemare's good too. So we'll just attack with the Vampire and not commit the Satyr Enchanter. Plus having an extra blocker back is still useful. Opponent's just gonna chum block, that's fine. We could also decide to play Conclave Tribunal here, second main, to exile the Vanguard, but I think we want to keep Tribunal for our opponent having their own Tribunal, so we can free up Shalai again. So there's no need to do it here. And then we're just waiting for a land for Prodigious Growth, otherwise we might just play Vinemare next turn, we'll see. Could also start activating Shalai if we draw 6th land. So we've got a lot of options here. Alright, there's a land. It is tempting to just put the Prodigious Growth on our Vampire token and attack with it, that way our opponent can't block with a Vanguard and pay for life. Like, it's technically a little bit safer to play Vinemare first and then go for the growth in case they have double Tribunal, but if they had one they would have already used it by now. So I think we go for it. And just enchant the largest creature so we get in more trample damage. And just attack with this one. Opponent takes it. We're up to 42, opponent down to 3. So opponent still does not have the City's Blessing. So it's still relatively safe to block here. I guess they could have double Pride of Conquerors here. But at 42, dying is not really a concern. So I could just see taking all the damage here. That's probably fine. Alright, they did have one Pride of Conquerors. Do they have a second one? They do. Alright, glad I didn't block then. Opponent gains 3. Still pretty far away from dying, and our opponent's super dead on the way back. Alright, sweet. Managed to beat the mono-white aggro. So we got to see the deck in action against a number of archetypes, mono-red, mono-white, which are all aggro decks, where, of course, all the lifelink enchantments really shine. The control matchups can be a bit more difficult, depending on how the opponent's removal spells line up with what we have going on, but overall, the deck mostly just loses to itself sometimes if you don't draw the right combination of creatures and enchantments, and if your creatures don't line up well in the matchup that you're playing. So that's gonna wrap things up for today's upgrade guide. Feel free to let me know in the comments which deck we should upgrade next, but for now, I wanna thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and as always, have a nice day. I also want to thank all my patrons for being part of the channel, and you can become a patron yourself today and decide the topic of future videos over at patreon.com/LegenVD.